talk. So welcome to this De Morgan Foundation talk on William De Morgan's feasibility of producing pottery in Egypt in the late 19th century. And this lecture is very kindly being given to us today by Hannah Mills, who is a PhD candidate in the School of Fine Arts in the History of Art and Culture at the University of Leeds. Having completed a joint honours degree in Heritage and History at Bath University and a Master's in History of Art at University College London. Her PhD research is focused around the home of Frederic Leighton being a centre for experimentation, from its conception to the work that inspired in its craftsmen who worked on the building. Hannah continues to conduct her research into the influence of the Middle East and North Africa on the British arts and crafts movement, as it was this subject that formed the basis of her master's dissertation. So my great pleasure to welcome Hannah today, and a talk that we're all really looking forward to. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you everyone for joining me. So if we can cast our minds back pre-pandemic to November of 2014, this was when everything sort of sparked for me. And I was studying for my undergraduate degree at Bath University, and we'd been tasked with working on a project called the London Project, and my group had chosen to work on the London Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And we thought it'd be a great idea to look at artists, architects, writers, all the sort of creatives. And I was particularly interested in the Cecil French Bequest, which was a collection of paintings from Frederic Leighton and other people. And I had booked to go to the Hammersmith and Fulham archives to see items from the bequest, and got there on the 16th November 2014, and they said they didn't have it. And I panicked a little bit, and then was told, go to Leighton House, they have some of the pieces on display. So I went over to Leighton House. I'd never been there before, and I turned up on the 17th of November 2014, and I walked in, got my ticket, and saw the Arab Hall, and just stopped. And it completely sparked a new direction in research and set me up for everything I've been doing over the last few years. And as we go through, you'll see November's a really interesting time. So November is where I sort of find other research, and it's also interesting for the story that I'm going to tell here. So then we cut to November of 2019, the 18th of November, so very similar. And I am at the British Library, and I'm starting my PhD research, sort of ramping it up from the sort of initial research that I'd done. And I called up a whole collection of pieces and work pertaining to William De Morgan, and in that stack was the William Friend De Morgan report on the feasibility of manufacture of glazed pottery in Egypt circa 1892 to 1896. And I didn't really know what to expect when I opened this book, full of both typed letters, written letters, reports, notes, drawings, and I'd never heard of this before. I briefly knew he'd done some work with the Egyptian government, but I wasn't so sure about what it contained. And as I sort of talk through this piece, there isn't much written about this. It's quite a forgotten subject in a way. You'll see it appear as sort of a line, oh, De Morgan worked with the Egyptian government, but there's never really been any substantial work on it. And the two pieces two works that really gave me the starting point were Emily Russell Barrington's biography of William De Morgan and Williamina Sterling's biography of the De Morgans as well. And they were the only two places that I'd seen any sort of mention of it, besides an odd line in places. And then through this, I began to sort of work out what this actually was and what he was doing. So I'm going to give you a very, very brief overview of De Morgan first, and how he got to the point where he was then working with the Egyptian government, and then we'll go into depth as to what he was working on. So his parents are incredible people and set William De Morgan up for his life. So you have his father, Augustus De Morgan, who was a mathematician who worked at University College London. He was from Madras in India, and one of his students was Ada Lovelace. And it's from Augustus that we think that De Morgan gained some of his interest in symmetry and into the sort of scientific side of his work. And from his mother, Sophia, who was a spiritualist, activist and writer, is where he got quite a lot of his fire, his activism, and particularly his work with the suffragist movement for women's rights. Here's the man himself and his wife, Mary Evelyn de Morgan nee Pickering. Now, Evelyn de Morgan is incredibly important in the story that I'm going to tell. And she was an artist, spiritualist, suffragist writer, and really helped De Morgan with his work and was instrumental in his work with the Egyptian government, as I'll tell later on. And the two of them met in August 1883 at a party when Evelyn was dressed as a tube of paint, rose madder paint. So you can tell they're quite characters here. Now, William de Morgan is by far more than just a potter. He's an incredible colorist. He is an incredible chemist. He started off his work with stained glass, and he's also a writer. And it's this writing that you see coming through in the report for the Egyptian government, because its descriptiveness and the way it reads, it's almost like he's telling a story. And you can see the foundations being laid for his later works. So our story starts with his early work into stained glass, and in 1863 he met William Morris at his studio at Red Lion Square. He was introduced by a fellow artist, Henry Halliday, and Morris saw that William was very, very interested in the arts, but was disillusioned with his own attempts at easel painting. So it was suggested that he began designing stained glass. And you can see from on screen here, you've got the design for St. Michael's stained glass window. And then you've got the Easter window depicting the Queen of Persia and St. Cecilia. And you can see the level of detail, the beauty, the fact that the glass shines like jewels there. And it was from his work with stained glass that he started to experiment with scientific investigation. And it's this that really drives his career. So true stained glass can only be yellow, and it's produced when it goes through the kiln. So other colours are created by pot metals that you lay on the molten glass during its production. Now, William, by his nature, is an inventor, and he worked mainly to start with stained glass, but he noticed that by starving the kiln of oxygen during its firing, a metallic deposit of silver oxide would be left on the surface of the glass, giving a kind of an opaque iridescent effect. Now, it's this that he then carries on to his pottery. So he noticed that this was very, very similar technique to lustreware, which is the beautiful ceramics of the 9th century, particularly in Egypt, that then spread through Syria, the wider Middle East and Europe, particularly along the Silk Roads. And it's the process of oxidization and the jewel-like quality that really interested him, and also the different temperatures. So typically firing around 1100 degrees centigrade and reducing the oxide to a very thin iridescent layer, almost like pure metal, gives it this really jewel-like sparkling quality. And you can see on the screen his sort of early tiles here. So you've got a rabbit and another sort of bear-like creature, very typical of De Morgan's work. So these are at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And then on the left to right, you've got a vase edition, another two-handled vase, all in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum, that are showing this lustreware process. Now, silver oxide gives a gold effect when successfully fired. And by altering the temperature of the kiln and also by adding sort of different oxides, you can get a sort of a pale rose to lavender, depending on the metallic concentration. Now, the lustreware coating is quite fragile and very, very easily damaged. And historically, it was only the sort of top potters and craftsmen, particularly in Iraq and Baghdad in around 750 to 1258 CE, that sort of started this process. Now, in Egypt, particularly Cairo, became the centre of this lustreware production and design. And it's from Egypt that most of the pieces that we still have, so old pieces today, they'll come from. And it's De Morgan's work with the Egyptian government that was to sort of restart this process, to re-get Cairo particularly being back the centre of lustreware pottery. And you can see that the process starts here. So you can see from these drawings, you've got design for lustreware vases at the top, and then you've got some other vases with some fantastical creatures on. And looking at the, I'm sorry about the quality of the image. This was taken back in 2019, and due to not being able to get back into the V&A, some of the images I've had to use that are just my reference ones for this one, so I do apologise on that. But if you look at the image at the top and you look down to the design for the pots on the left-hand side, you can see the sort of emergence of a almost sort of pseudo-Persian design there. And it's this that is picked up and noticed by the Egyptian government, that not only is he great at the lustreware process, not only is he an expert in it, but he also understands the designing process as well. If you go down, there's the glaze colour testers on a tile where he was experimenting with the different glazes and the different colours. Now, he's renowned as a colour man. So De Morgan is incredibly knowledgeable on colour, what colours go together and how different glazes and different oxides can produce those different colours. So that's what sets him apart from the rest, really, is that not only is his skill and his ambition and experimentation, but also his use and being able to work with colour. So we have here an example of moonlight lustreware, which was what he was working on towards the end of the 1890s. So around the same time that he starts his work with the Egyptian government. And it's where he uses the oxides to create this almost pearlescent glaze that combines both copper and silver oxide, and it almost gives the effect of a kind of a pearlescent moonlight just sort of hitting the top of the piece over coloured ceramics, and you can see that there, and that's coming in at the same time as he's working with the Egyptian government. Now, one of the most important commissions that he worked on was the Arapol at Leighton House. And here are some plans from the Building News from October 1880 that show the design of Leighton House. And you can see you've got the north elevation and the studio window, and you can see the exterior of the Arapol there with its domed top, quite sort of at odds with the early house, which was really a kind of Italian French studio house. Now, Leighton House is important because it's seen to be one of the first studio houses in London, and it's also one of the houses that starts Holland Park and sort of introduces Holland Park as a artistic area and influences other houses, and that's what I'm sort of looking at with my PhD. But it's also important because it's been described as one of the finest examples of Middle Eastern tiles anywhere in the UK. So we have here as well the Building News for November 1886. You've got here showing the hallway, And then you also have the designs for the Arab Hall by George Atchison, showing the gold and the tiles, and you can just see how opulent and beautiful it is. If we move into the room, so for those of you that haven't been to Leighton House or seen the Arab Hall, this picture in no means does it justice. You actually have to go in there and experience it. But essentially there is he collected around 1,000 15th and 16th century tiles, mostly from Damascus, Turkey, Iraq. There's a few others in there as well. Not all of the tiles have exactly been pinned down to where they exactly come from. But he was creating, Leighton was creating a space that was based around his travels and around different places that he'd seen. So for instance, the Alhambra in Spain, the Lizia, the palace in Palermo, Sicily, and other places. And it was kind of a culmination of all of these ideas and things he liked. And he collected and sort of brought together a group of artisans to really make this happen. So you have his architect, George Atchison, who comes in and designs the flooring and some of the columns and the sort of the initial space. And then you have de Morgan, who is brought in to curate and also to create facsimile tiles to fill in the blanks and also to repair the ones that are broken. And it's this that gives de Morgan a chance to really work with the original pieces, and it elevates his work even more. So he's working on this in the late 1870s into 1881. And he was commissioned to do the work for a year and paid the sum of £278. So around the equivalent of 23,000 to 24,000 in today's money. Now, this was a far bigger project than just a year, and it took longer. Now, what's really interesting is, so Emily Barrington wrote a 2-volumed biography of Frederic Leighton, and it's from that we glean much about the Arab Hall and also about the different artisans and creatives that were being brought in. And on the 22nd of March 1871, a letter is sent from the explorer Richard Francis Burton to Leighton talking about tiles. And he says, "I have just returned from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, or yours of April 14th, 1871. Would not have remained so long unanswered and not to business. I am quite as willing to have a house pulled down for you and now as when at Vichy. But the difficulty is to find a house with tiles. The bric-a-brac sellers have quite learnt their value and determined extravagant sums for poor articles. Of course you want good old specimens, and these are waxing very rare. My friend Drake and Palmer were lucky enough when at Jerusalem to noble a score or so from a so-called Mosque of Omar. Large stores are there found, but unhappily under charge, and I fancy that long payments would be required. My wife and I will keep a sharp lookout for you and buy up as many as we can find which seem to answer your description. If native inscription, white or blue, for instance, are to be had, I shall secure them, but not if imperfect. Some clearing of rubbish is expected at Damascus. The Englishman who superintends is a friend of mine, and I shall not neglect to get from him as much as possible." So what they're talking about there is the tiles that have inscriptions on them. And the trade in tiles in the 19th century was booming because their work was being recognised and they were so much in fashion. And though you have people like William de Morgan creating sort of not quite facsimiles, but Persian examples, if you can afford them, people want the originals, for instance, Leighton. And so this is talking about the collecting of those tiles there. Now, if we move on, we can see here there's a close-up of those tiles, and you can see that they're not perfect. So they came over on a Thomas Crook ship, and then they were piled up in the garden of Leighton House for a while they were being sorted, and while drawings were being made of specific tiles for their repair and also for where they were going to fit in. And so there was a few damages en route and also when they were in the garden. So De Morgan really had to work. And you can see on the second image just how damaged some of them were.
Hannah,
yes.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you. As you're moving, I think your desk is creaking quite a lot, and because it's quite close to the microphone, it's a bit distracting.
Sorry.
Just thought I'd let you know. No, thank you so much.
That's okay. I will sit very still. Sorry.
Thank you.
That's okay. Sorry, everyone. So as you can see, here's a close-up of the tiles that we saw on the previous slide, and you can see the damage that's there. Now, what's really interesting is when I was working through the V&A's archive of William de Morgan's work back in 2019, the day that they closed before the pandemic, March 17th, I believe it was, I came across these. Now, they have been written about before, but they've been written about as being De Morgan's own designs. But what you can see from this is that they are copies of those tiles that we saw in the previous slide. Now, it's not upside down. The number was put on upside down, but that's the right way up. And you can see just the level of detail, and you can see how he worked out where it fits in with the other tiles and other designs. And on the wall next to it, there is a slightly smaller version of this, of the pattern, in a panel with several other tiles. But it's interesting that that one was particularly chosen, and you can see the damage that was on the previous slightly bigger tile there. So whereas it was previously believed that these were De Morgan's own designs, they're not. They were so that he could piece together the tiles and also for repairs. Now, moving on to Egypt, it's important to note Egyptomania. So in the 18th and 19th century, we have a huge uptake of people being obsessed with Egypt and with the Middle East. And that's why you get Leighton and others like him, Orientalists, becoming really interested in obtaining items from the Middle East, North Africa, and creating this sort of Oriental palace-like feel around them. The colour blue is considered to be very important and very reminiscent of the Middle East, and very kind of seductive and beautiful and exotic, partly because of lapis lazuli coming from Afghanistan to Venice through the Silk Roads in the 13th century and being used in paint and also in jewellery. So that's what sort of kickstarts it off. So you have that, and then you have this resurgence of Egyptomania. So you have mummy unwrappings, and you can see that the image on the top there is a view of a public mummy unwrapping. You also have Napoleon in Egypt as well, and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which really starts to sort of kickstart the imagination. And then you have a phenomenon called mummy wheat, which I just had to add in here because it's absolutely bonkers. It's the idea that by taking ancient grains from the wrappings or caskets of mummies, you could grow ancient wheat to make bread. Kew Gardens has a go at it. Many different scientists, horticulturalists all get involved in this. And this is just an example from the Ipswich Museum. And then you also have there in Philadelphia, they're writing about it in the papers. Now, Edith Nesbit writes a poem entitled Mummy Wheat, and W.B. Yeats also writes a poem about mummy wheat as well. So you can just sort of see this kind of fever that's coming around Egypt. And the travel books that were being produced, and also you have Thomas Cook going out to Egypt as well to take passengers. So you can understand why De Morgan would be interested in lustreware, Egyptian ceramics, and also have this connection and ability to get information on this as well, not just because of the tiles coming back, but also because of this sort of obsession with everything Middle Eastern and North African. So one thing I wanted to point out as well is his work with P&O to design panels for their liners. So we have the mosque panel here, and this is a design that you can see in the Victoria and Albert Museum's collection. So all of the pieces that I'm showing from the Victoria and Albert Museum's collection were donated in 1917 by Evelyn after William's death. And they are incredible because they chart not only his work with, for instance, P&O, also with Leighton House, but also the process in terms of the lustreware and the process that he was going through in creating that. But the next one's really important, and I apologise for the quality. I've zoomed in on a few in the next slide. And this is from the parts of the world panels that he was designing. And you've got here Egypt, China and India, but the Egyptian one's really incredible. And he's designing this at around the same time that he's starting to work with the Egyptian government. And we'll see in a moment, he talks in letters very openly about getting to ride a camel and how absolutely incredible that was, and actually seeing the pyramids firsthand himself. So out of everything, the Egyptian one is probably the most accurate because he's seen there. And then you have a tile panel that would sit around those, and it appears on several ships as well, including the Vadia, which is the ship that was designed for the Russian royal family as well. And you can see there's the blues and the very sort of Persian sort of style flowers. And once again, it's the exotic blues again. It's the idea of exoticism, imagination, sort of a lust. Now, I've put the reference to the text that I'm working on here because it's such a long reference that I've put it on one slide. So do sort of take a picture or note it down, anybody's interested in that one, but it is a very long reference. But as I sort of mentioned before, in 2019, I pulled this or requested this book up from the archives at the British Library, opened it up and was wondering what it was. And it's incredible. So it's all of William de Morgan's notes on his time out in Egypt, his time working with the potters out there, and also his trials and tribulations in terms of whether actually it was feasible. So you can see here, and that's the really lovely note of when they acquired it in August 1964. So I've also included some letters here, and this one of December 28th, 1892 is really when De Morgan is talking to his partner, Halsey Ricardo, about being approached to work on this project. And he's talking about how astonished he is, and the fact that other Kensingtonians, as he calls them, were kindly telling the Egyptian Minister of Public Instruction that he was the very man for the project that they wanted to work on, because of his skill in recreating lustreware and his knowledge of pottery, tiles, and it was that work with Leighton House that really gives him that extra knowledge in terms of the different biscuit firings, and also the makeup of the glazes, and how to work with original pieces and repair them. So as you can see on screen, he's quite interested in sort of being taken out to Egypt, and you can see there's the sort of start of the kind of glimpse of inkling of what he's going to be doing. Now, he was previously approached in November of that year, just tentatively approached, but they really sort of aimed to get in December. Now, by the January, he's actually heading off to Egypt. So you can see that he's heading off on the Hydaspes on Tuesday, the 24th of January, 1893. Now, what I need to do is go to the Thomas Cook archives that are up in Leicester, because I haven't been able to because of the pandemic, and really see if that's a particular Thomas Cook ship, or to just check general shipping records, because I was tentatively looking and I can't find that particular ship at the moment. But because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to get into those archives. But what I'm going to be looking for is not only his journeys to and from Egypt, but also when he was sending things backwards and forwards. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But as you can see here, he sets off from Florence, where he's staying, goes to Rome, then to Naples, and then takes the ship to Egypt. And you can see here, so this is a slightly later map. So this is from 1897, and it's the Bartholomew's tourist map of Egypt and the Lower Nile. So where the little circle is where De Morgan is headed for Cairo. And the De Morgan family have a connection with Egypt. So his nephew had been out in Egypt and had died in around the 1870s, 1880s. And then later on, his sister Mary would go out to Egypt to work with a girls' school and then die there. So there's quite a connection with Egypt and the De Morgan family. But you can see from this map where he's headed. Now, Evelyn is also writing to Hansi Ricardo at this point to say that he's arrived safely on the Saturday, and that she's worried about the state of Egypt at that point, because Egypt's in a little bit of turmoil in terms of the government, because it's primarily being run by the British, and is not quite part of the empire, but sort of. And there's a little bit of sort of turmoil there. So she's quite worried about him being there, but also she's optimistic about his health, because they've been traveling to Italy during the winters because William had been diagnosed wrongly with tuberculosis of the spine. And so it was thought that the Italian winters would be less harsh than our cold British winters on his body. And then going to Egypt would have a good effect on him as well. So he stayed at the Villa Victoria Hotel, which was a tourist hotel, primarily for Brits heading over there. And this is the dining room that you can see on the postcard there. And you can see that there's sort of pseudo hieroglyphic tomb paintings on the walls. And then from the outside of the Villa Victoria, you can see that it's on a very interesting old Curry Street. And these were postcards that you could buy at the hotel and send back to loved ones. So the first one is owned by the University of Durham and hasn't been written on. And then the second one was a postcard that had been written on in 1913 and was up for sale recently, I think for around $5. And both images really give you a sense of where De Morgan was staying, what it would have been like for him there. I think it's really interesting to see the dining room and what was on the walls and what kind of things he would be seeing while working there. So you can see at the top there, from February the 19th of 1893, he's staying at the Villa Victoria. And he's talking about having real trouble finding flint. So what he'd been sent out to do was to look at the feasibility of building kilns, whether lustreware production could actually start up again. So in order to do that, you needed to do double firings of the ceramics to really get the glazes to shine. And for that, you needed fuel. And what you particularly needed was wood to fuel it. And you also needed flint as well. And those were quite hard to come by. So as it says here, he's been trying for 3 weeks to get hold of flint and has so far had a lot of trouble. And he's really trying to get the flint. And he talks about, in this letter and in further letters, about having real trouble in getting anybody to move quite quickly in terms of really saying, I need these materials. And it's quite funny to sort of read his letters, and I've got here. So he says about trying to get some flint for 3 weeks, and he's had a go at throwing some pots, trying salt glaze, which appears to be the only commercial possibility where the fuel is too dear for 2 firings, because it's also really expensive. Wood is quite hard to come by in Cairo for firings, and the sheer quantity that they need. And he talks about the mix of clay with sand that he's been assured contains 96% of silica. And he's arranging samples of clay, which we're going to see on another slide. I've got the images where he clearly marks out the different clays and the different amounts of silica, water in the clay, and other minerals. And he takes samples, both just sort of clay samples that are still malleable wet that he sends back, and he's also working on and studying in Egypt. And then he also does some test firings. So he fires them in bars, first of all, before throwing any pots, just to see if it's possible. And he talks about mixing pastes as soon as he can get hold of flint. So that's the big problem he's got. And he talks about that everything's much slower there and it takes 8 weeks to get anything. But what I find to be really quite funny is a trip to Egypt is well worth having, if only to see the Arabs laugh and ride the donkeys. But there's also the pyramids and the camels. I rode one yesterday, and the Sphinx and the dervishes and the mosques and the citadel, and wandering about amazingly picturesque streets at night, losing one's way and being brought back on a donkey. The last entertainment is my favourite. So he clearly likes riding around on the donkeys as well. And you can see here, so there's a huge language barrier that's happening between the Egyptian potters and also between De Morgan. And you can see he's written on the back of one of his notes from Egypt, where no English is spoken. And he writes in other letters about having a lot of trouble trying to communicate, and that sort of adds to the problems, including getting fuel and other materials. But you can see there William de Morgan's list of samples that he's sending back. And he writes to Hounsey Ricardo about sending samples back, and via Thomas Cook, and wondering when they'll get there. So he talks about, to the other thing is a case of 2 containing Egyptian clays, etc., will probably arrive either at Fulham or the Vale in charge of Cook. Warn them at the factory that they may be taken in. I should, however, imagine that Cook's people will write only, I have misgivings that my directions about sending may have never reached the senders, and mistakes will occur. Now, it does take several weeks for them to come back, for him to get them, but he does use some of those clays later on to produce a pot. Now, I'm having real trouble tracking this pot down, and if anybody knows where it is, please put a comment in that, or at the end of put an email on, please contact me, because I'm really trying to find out where this potteries that De Morgan threw using clays he brought back from Egypt. It was a lustreware pot. In terms of what was actually on it, I don't know. It was more of a, from what I can gather from the Emily Barrington biography of De Morgan, it's a two-handled vase. But other than that, I don't know. I haven't seen any images of it, and trying to track it down has proved very, very difficult. But it's something I'm going to keep doing. But if any of you know, please let me know, because I'd be really interested to see it. But what's really interesting is on the list of the samples, is you can see the different types of clay and the different amounts of the different minerals that are in those clays. So it really highlights again what an incredible chemist and scientist De Morgan was. So we know him for his artistic qualities, but it's this document that for me really highlights, more than anything else, is a really sort of tangible way of seeing how incredible he was in his knowledge in terms of science and the different amounts of silica that was needed, aluminium that was needed, to produce ceramics. And you can see here there's also some designs, and you can see there's a kiln design there, because not only was he having to find the materials and the fuel for firing, but he was also having to design the kilns. And he talks quite openly about having to actually get his hands dirty and help build these kilns with the bricks. And there's a little design there. And what I thought was really interesting was when I was at the Victoria and Albert Museum, I was looking at his kiln designs for Sands End, and also previously for Merton Abbey. And I find it really interesting that he's helping with these designs for the kilns. And then when he goes out to Egypt, he's having to sort of redesign them again and build them on a much simpler scale. So you could see the other one was sort of a much simpler kiln to what he's creating here. But I thought it was a nice sort of connection. Once again, apologies for the lights on those images. They're under plastic to protect them. And unfortunately, I couldn't get back to get sort of better images of these. And then we've got more examples of different glazes, and also of different clays and the different geographical locations of these clays. So he's not just taking them from one area, he's going out to the Red Sea as well and collecting clay and different areas of Egypt. So he's in communication with different scouts that are going out to collect clay for him, and he's going himself as well. And I need to do more sort of research into this, because as I said, there's really nothing written on it. There's a little bit from Emily Barrington's work is probably the most complete, or has got the most information out of everything. But it's still quite lacking in terms of what's there. But you can see that he's really looking at the water content. You can see there the silica content, the aluminium content, the lime content, because all of this plays into what's feasible in terms of the clays, but also how it's going to affect with the firing and what fuel they're going to need as well. And then this letter, which I thought was really interesting, sent on the 13th of September 1893 from Douglas Dunlop, mentions his work, this particular project being mentioned in the Egyptian Journal, and it really shows and highlights the work he's doing, kind of brings it to the public forefront. And that's the only other piece that I've seen that it's in there. And it gives a rough overview of what he's doing. And it says there, the feasibility of a naive industry. And it really is, because they haven't been producing pottery or lustreware pottery in Egypt for hundreds of years by that point. So So they want to restart that industry, re-kick that industry, and also try and get rid of, or use it to get rid of some of the debt that Egypt has accrued. So that's one of the reasons for working on it. But this letter I find really interesting. So for anybody who is interested in Egyptology, like myself, will notice there's a name on here, Flinders Petrie. And they actually consult Flinders Petrie on the clay and on the particular samples and whether they would be any good for turning pots, particularly pots using original, I don't want to say recipes, but original designs and original methods is the word I would use. And I think it's really interesting that so many incredible people are working on this one project. When I was at UCL, I would often go to the Petrie Museum and look at his vast collection that's there of Egyptian artifacts. So when I saw this in 2019, I just had a very happy moment of, oh my gosh, this just gets better and better. And in that, they're talking about the potassium soda that's in the clays, and also whether it's worth doing, and whether there are the skills of potters out there in Egypt to be able to create this work as well, and also the alkalis and minerals that are in the different clays. So this is where things get really interesting, because in the two places that this is mentioned to an extent, and when I say an extent, it's probably half a page that it's mentioned in Barrington's biography and also in William Sterling's biography. They both mentioned that he finished the work in 1894, but this is from January 1895, where he's talking about sending over the proofs of the Egyptian report that then come back, and he marks them up and works on. And those are the proofs that appear in the second half of the document that I'm working on. So the first half, to give you context, is his initial kind of findings when he first gets there, the initial sampling of different clays, both when he's in England, when he's throwing them, and also his work in Egypt. And then you start having letters, and then towards the end you've got a typed up version of the report where he's crossed out and scribbled through and written things over the top in purple ink. It's really fascinating to also just see the process of him writing as well. And it's that document, the proofs, that I've been looking at the British Library. And in this report, he kind of comes to the conclusion that it's, as far as I can see so far, it's possible, but they can't do 2 firings due to the lack of fuel. And that there needs to be considerable work done to speed up processes and to actually have the materials needed for this one as well. So it's still very much a work in progress, because as I said, there's really been nothing written about this before, and I'm still uncovering things. And in the early hours of this morning, when I was going over my notes and really looking into this, I came across that there was potentially another copy at the Victoria and Albert Museum that was a more coherent, complete copy, because what's at the British Library is his notes and the rough drafts, but the Victoria and Albert Museum seems to have a more complete copy. And as soon as they open up their reading rooms and study rooms, I'm going to see if I can go and have a look at it and see what the main conclusions are, because I have a gist from what I've seen so far, and from Barrington's biography, and also from the biography by Sterling. But it would be nice to see what he actually puts. Also, when you look at the biographies, there tends to be emphasis on this being the setup for his writing career. as a novelist. So it's this work that is probably the most significant piece of writing that he does before that point. And what they do is they talk about him not only harnessing his skills in terms of pottery, but also working at honing his skills for writing. But what Barrington does note is that she goes into more detail in terms of there being no wood to fire the kilns, and that modern coal would not be sufficient to get the same lustre ware there and the same colouring on the pottery, and that wood is really difficult to obtain. So that's what we were seeing in his letters, and then it's reaffirmed in Barrington's biography that it's the wood that's difficult to get hold of there as well. But it's from Barrington that I read about this particular vase that was thrown using the clay from Egypt, and that it was in the possession of Mr. Mossop. So Mr. Mossop is somebody that collects or acquired a lot of De Morgan tiles and other pieces of pottery when excavations were done in his back garden. Lots of tile fragments were found. So it would be interesting to see if that vase is still out there. And as I said before, if anybody knows anything, please let me know, because I'd be really interested in seeing it, or even if it's in fragments, seeing it as well. And then I move on to something else that it's vaguely connected, but I'm working on alongside, and I'm hoping to sort of join the dots, because this is all very much fragmented. And this is forming chapter 4 of my PhD, the work with the Egyptian government, because of Leighton House helped set De Morgan on that path somewhat as well. And this is a letter from Frederic Goodall, the Orientalist artist, to Mr. Frederic Leighton, who was the secretary of the Royal Academy, also a medievalist, and who edited Murray's Handbook on Egypt in 1870. Goodall was an Orientalist painter who went through Egypt quite extensively, brought back lots of sheep and goats to paint, and was well known for capturing very sort of more accurate landscapes of Egypt than anywhere else. And essentially this is talking about going to Lord Leighton's funeral. So it's dated January the 30th, 1896. And it talks about going to the academy at the time named on the notice, and actually attending Lord Leighton's funeral. And Goodall writes in his sort of memoirs later on about the funeral and sitting next to Millie in the carriage, and really what it was like to attend. But I acquired this letter last week, and what I'm really interested in is, because you've got Frederic Leighton, who was very interested and knowledgeable on North Africa and the Middle East. You've also got Frederic Goodall, who'd been to Egypt, was bringing back sheep and goat, was very renowned for his paintings. And then you've got Frederic Leighton, who was the secretary of the Royal Academy, and who was also editing Murray's Handbook on Egypt in 1870. Whether they helped De Morgan at all with his work in Egypt, categorically know that Leighton and De Morgan knew each other. But in terms of Goodall and Leighton, I'm not really finding any concrete evidence that they ever communicated or knew each other. Now, if anybody knows anything, please let me know, because this is something I'm continuing with as well. But I thought I would share that as kind of an aside. And you can see the three gentlemen there. So you've got Frederic Leighton, Sir Frederic Alexis Eaton, and Frederic Goodall on the end there as well. So thank you, everybody, for listening to me. And there's my email, should you have any answers to those questions that I put out there, or tweet me. I'm occasionally aiming to get a bit better on Twitter. So
Bravo, Hannah, thank you so much. That was absolutely illuminating, and you just uncovered so much material that I certainly haven't seen in the British Library as well, and being able to apply that to sort of this thinking about De Morgan as sort of an Orientalist and an Egyptologist, as well as a chemist and a scientist, which he just doesn't really get enough credit for, as I'm sure you're painfully aware, having not found many interpretations of that material. So huge congratulations on the research to date. It's definitely useful and will really increase our understanding, I think, of everything in that field. So if anyone does have any questions, please do feel free to ask away. If you can see the chat box, Hannah, then there are some lovely thanks and words of thanks coming in. But one question is, where will you be publishing in the future? I know that might be a while off.
Yes, it is going to be a while off at the moment. I'm in the process of, so I have my upgrade, or transfer as it's called, coming up in March, where I'm going to transfer from being, because I'm a part-time PhD student, so transfer from being sort of first year into my second year. And then I was talking about this morning actually, I'm planning, this is going to form sort of chapter 3 of my thesis, but I am planning to collate all of this research, keep going with it, and turn it into a more of a paper. But I don't know where yet, but there will be something, definitely, soon.
And what we'd love to do, Hannah, is if you let us know when and where that is, then we can always share that through the De Morgan newsletter and on our channels as well, because it's obviously so relevant to the work of the foundation. Any other questions or notes or points for Hannah about that that work? I think it was so comprehensive, Hannah, and you sort of covered everything from how it, sort of infiltrated all aspects of De Morgan's work that people are just lots of thanks coming through, and from myself included as well. Okay, so one question is, how did De Morgan's work in Egypt influence his pottery work back in Egypt?
So this is where it's really interesting, because from the later letters that I was looking at, so just when he's sort of sending off the full manuscript to the Egyptian government, you start to get interspersed letters between himself and Jose Ricardo talking about the money troubles they were having and the fact that they were having to wind down their business. So it kind of comes right at the end of his career. But in terms of any pottery that he was working on, from what I can see so far, and this is very tentative, you have the creation of the moonlight lustre, which is coming along the same time as he's working with the Egyptian government. So there's definitely a link there. And also his work, you get a sort of a resurgence of very sort of Persian-esque design. And I say Persian-esque because that's what it was. Persian design is what it was called. Puts there, missed this. Did the invitation from De Morgan come from the Egyptian government? Yes, it did. So it came from the government, but he'd been sort of talked up by several of his friends in Kensington. So the Kensingtonians that he was talking about, they sort of really bigged him up and said, this is the person you need to contact, because the Egyptian government and the British government that were working in Egypt at the time were very aware that they needed to kickstart something to start repaying Egypt's debts. And they thought the pottery would be a good route to go down. And so they approached De Morgan after he'd been sort of talked up by his friends on that one.
Yeah, it clearly shows that his reputation at the end of the 19th century was absolute as one of the sort of real trusted sources on pottery making beyond the design, which I think we often get lost in because the designs are so beautiful and so consuming. But you've really enlightened us onto sort of what the process was behind putting those designs together. Thank you. And another question, Hannah, and I think just finally, given that we're up to the hour, is did De Morgan study lustre work in any other countries?
So he did study the Majolica ware and Italian pottery at the same time. So he is looking at that, and that definitely does feed into his work. I wouldn't quite call it lustreware, but it's along the same vein. But when he's looking at the overall lustreware, it's mainly Egypt, but he does also look at tiles and ceramics from Iraq, Turkey, and many other countries in the Middle East and North Africa as well. So they are feeding in, but his main focus is with Damascus and Iznik pottery for his work with Leighton, and then later on the Egyptian pottery for his work with the Egyptian government. But he is sort of aware, as far as I can see from letters and from the overall document, he is aware of other places, but I really need to pin that down a bit better as well.
Great, well, I shall leave it there, Hannah, and let you get on with your day. Thank you so much again for a brilliant talk, and I'll make sure I keep an eye out for double-handled lustreware vases, and see if I come across anything that looks suspect in the clay, and let you know. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Hannah.